Right now, at this very moment, something remarkable is happening. Or more precisely, something remarkable isn't happening. For the first time in 7 million years, human evolution might have stopped. Not slowed down, stopped. And the weirdest part? We did it to ourselves. Think about that for a second. Every species on Earth is evolving. Right now. This second. Bacteria are developing resistance to antibiotics. Insects are adapting to pesticides. Birds are changing their migration patterns. Fish are growing smaller in overfished oceans. Evolution never stops. It's the fundamental law of life on this planet. Except maybe for us. We're the exception, the rule breaker, the species that looked at 7 million years of evolutionary pressure and said, yeah, we're done with that. And somehow we got away with it. Your ancestors, go back far enough, were constantly being tested by nature. If you couldn't run fast enough, you got eaten. If you couldn't find food during the drought, you starved. If you couldn't handle the cold, you froze. If you were born with a genetic disorder, you probably didn't survive long enough to have kids. Nature was brutal, merciless, and completely indifferent to your suffering. That's how evolution works. It's not pretty, but it's effective. But you? You're reading this probably lying in bed or sitting on a couch in a climate-controlled room with access to more food than you can eat, protected from predators, diseases mostly under control. And even if you were born with conditions that would have been fatal a few thousand years ago, modern medicine might let you live a completely normal life. You've escaped. We've all escaped. And that escape might be the most significant biological event in human history. If you're using this to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe and tell me where you are and what time it is. I read the comments and it's fascinating. Tokyo at sunrise, London at lunch, Los Angeles at midnight, all watching the same story about how we became the species that broke the rules. Here's the paradox that's going to keep scientists arguing for decades. Evolution made humans smart enough to escape evolution. We evolved big brains, opposable thumbs, complex language, and social cooperation. And then we use those exact traits to build a world where evolution can't touch us anymore. It's like evolution created its own off switch. But before you think this is simple, before you assume we've just stopped changing, here's where it gets complicated. Some scientists say we're evolving faster than ever. Others say we stopped 10,000 years ago. Some claim we're on the verge of a new kind of evolution, one we control ourselves. And a few argue that we're actually devolving, getting genetically weaker with each generation. They're all right, and they're all wrong. Because the truth is so much stranger than any single answer. See, evolution isn't one thing. It's a process with multiple mechanisms, and we've managed to shut down some of them while accidentally accelerating others. We've stopped natural selection in most cases, but genetic drift is still happening. We're not adapting to our environment anymore because we've adapted the environment to us instead. We've replaced biological evolution with cultural evolution, and it's happening so fast that our genes can't keep up. The story of how we got here is written in your DNA. It's visible in your skeleton, your immune system, the structure of your brain. It's in the foods you can digest and the diseases you can survive. Every part of your body is a historical document, evidence of millions of years of evolutionary pressure that suddenly, recently, just stopped applying. We're going to trace this entire journey tonight, from the very beginning, when our ancestors were just another ape species trying not to get eaten, all the way to right now, when we're editing our own genes and talking about colonizing other planets. We'll walk through 7 million years of human evolution, see how it worked, understand why it was so brutal, and then watch as our ancestors figured out piece by piece how to escape it. We'll explore the moment 10,000 years ago when everything changed, when we stopped being nomadic hunter-gatherers and started farming. That's when the Great Escape really began. We'll see how medicine let us survive things that should have killed us, how clothing and shelter let us live in climates that should have been impossible, how modern society has created an environment where natural selection barely functions anymore. And then we'll tackle the big question, the one that keeps evolutionary biologists up at night. Are we still evolving? Is evolution something that can actually stop? And if it has stopped, what does that mean for the future of humanity? The answers are going to surprise you. Because the story of human evolution isn't over. It's just entered a phase that's never happened before in the history of life on Earth. A phase where the species itself decides what comes next. So get comfortable, let your mind relax, and let's figure out together how humans became the species that evolution couldn't hold back. The species that stopped evolving, and what that really means for all of us. Before we can understand why humans might have stopped evolving, we need to talk about what evolution actually is. Because here's the thing, most people think they understand evolution, but what they're actually carrying around in their heads is a Hollywood version. A simplification that's just close enough to the truth to be dangerous. Evolution isn't progress. It's not a ladder that species climb toward perfection. It's not some cosmic force guiding life toward bigger brains or better bodies. It's something much simpler and much stranger than that. Evolution is what happens when living things make copies of themselves, and those copies aren't quite perfect. That's it. That's the foundation of everything. Imperfect copying plus time equals evolution. But the devil's in the details, and those details are where things get really interesting. Let's start with the mechanism, the engine that drives all evolutionary change, natural selection. It's such a familiar term that we forget how radical the idea really is. Before Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859, people assumed species were fixed, created as they are and unchanging. The idea that life could transform itself, that fish could become amphibians, that ape-like ancestors could become humans, was borderline heretical. Darwin's insight was beautifully simple. Every generation of every species produces more offspring than can possibly survive. A single oak tree might produce thousands of acorns in a season, but only a handful will grow into new trees. A pair of rabbits could theoretically produce millions of descendants in just a few years, but rabbit populations don't explode to infinity. Most rabbits die before reproducing. The question Darwin asked was this: which ones survive and which ones die? Is it random, or is there a pattern? The answer changed everything. It's not random. The individuals with traits that help them survive in their specific environment are slightly more likely to reach reproductive age and pass on their genes. The ones with traits that hurt their chances are slightly more likely to die before reproducing. Generation after generation, this tiny bias compounds. The helpful traits become more common, the harmful traits become less common. Over enough time, the population changes. That's natural selection. Not a conscious process, not a plan, just statistics playing out across millions of lives and millions of years. But here's where people get confused. Evolution doesn't mean getting better in any absolute sense. It means getting better adapted to a specific environment at a specific time. A trait that helps you survive in one environment might kill you in another. Thick fur is great if you're a mammoth in the Ice Age, but it's a death sentence if you're suddenly living in the Sahara. This is crucial because it means evolution has no direction, no goal, no end point. There's no such thing as a more evolved species or a less evolved species. A bacteria living in your gut is just as evolved as you are. It's been adapting to its environment for exactly as long as your ancestors have been adapting to theirs. It's just that its environment is your intestines, and its adaptations are things like rapid reproduction and chemical resistance, not big brains and opposable thumbs. So how do we actually measure evolution? How do scientists look at a population and say, yes, this is evolving, or no, this has stayed the same? The answer is genes. Specifically, changes in gene frequencies across generations. Every trait you have, from your eye color to your height to your susceptibility to certain diseases, is influenced by genes. These are segments of DNA that code for proteins, and proteins build and run your body. When we talk about evolution, we're really talking about which versions of genes become more or less common in a population over time. This happens through mutation. Every time a cell copies its DNA, there's a tiny chance of making a mistake. Most mutations do nothing. They're in parts of the genome that don't code for anything important, or they make changes so small they don't affect how the organism functions. Some mutations are harmful, causing diseases or reducing survival chances, but a very few, are beneficial. They give the organism some advantage in its environment. When a beneficial mutation appears, natural selection can spread it through the population. The individual with the mutation is slightly more likely to survive and reproduce. Their children inherit the mutation, and if they also have better survival odds, they pass it on to their children. Over many generations, what started as a random copying error in one individual's DNA becomes a standard feature of the entire species. This process takes time, a lot of time. To get major evolutionary changes, the kind that turn one species into another, you typically need millions of years. This is because most beneficial mutations provide only tiny advantages, maybe a 1 or 2% better chance of survival. That tiny advantage needs thousands of generations to spread through the entire population. And that's just for one mutation. To get complex adaptations like wings or eyes or human intelligence, you need hundreds or thousands of beneficial mutations all accumulating and building on each other. Think of it like compound interest. Put a penny in a savings account with 1% interest, and you barely notice the growth for years. But leave it for thousands of years and that penny turns into a fortune. Evolution works the same way. Tiny advantages compound across geological timescales until you get transformations that seem impossible. But here's where things get weird. Evolution doesn't always move at the same speed. Sometimes it crawls along so slowly that species barely change for millions of years. Sharks have looked basically the same for 400 million years. Crocodiles for 200 million. These animals found body plans that worked incredibly well for their environments, and they've stuck with them. Not because they stopped evolving, they're still accumulating mutations, still experiencing natural selection, but because any major changes would make them worse at what they do. This is called evolutionary stasis, and it's more common than people realize. Most species, most of the time, aren't transforming into something else. They're just maintaining the adaptations they already have. Then occasionally something changes. The environment shifts dramatically. A new predator appears. A disease sweeps through. A population gets isolated on an island. Suddenly the old adaptations aren't good enough anymore. Natural selection intensifies. The population either adapts quickly or goes extinct. And when I say quickly, I mean quickly in evolutionary terms, maybe thousands or tens of thousands of years instead of millions. This is called punctuated equilibrium. long periods of stasis interrupted by relatively rapid bursts of change. It's how we get strange things like Darwin's finches, a single ancestral bird species that colonized the Galapagos Islands and split into 14 different species in just a few million years, each adapted to different food sources on different islands. Or consider the peppered moth in industrial England. Before the Industrial Revolution, most peppered moths were light-coloured, which camouflaged them against light-coloured tree bark. Dark-coloured moths existed but were rare because birds could spot and eat them easily. Then pollution from factories darkened the trees. Suddenly the light moth stood out and the dark moths were camouflaged. Within 50 years, dark moths went from rare to common. That's evolution in real time, observable across a human lifetime. But that was just a colour change, one gene switching from one variant to another. The moths didn't develop new organs or new behaviours. For that kind of major change, you need more time and more environmental pressure. Or do you? Some scientists think rapid evolution might be more common than we realized, especially in small populations facing extreme environmental stress. This brings us back to humans and to that bottleneck 900,000 years ago. 1,280 individuals struggling to survive for 117,000 years in the worst climate conditions in human history. That's exactly the kind of scenario that could trigger rapid evolutionary change. Small population, intense selection pressure, long time frame. And something did change during that bottleneck. Our ancestors went in as one species and came out as something different, something with the genetic and behavioral tools to eventually dominate the planet. The question is, did evolution stop after that? Or is it still happening, just in ways we don't recognize? Because here's what most people don't understand. Evolution never truly stops. As long as organisms are reproducing and dying at different rates, as long as mutations are happening, as long as environments are changing, natural selection continues. It might slow down, it might become harder to detect, but it never stops completely. Even in modern humans, with our medicine and technology, some genes are becoming more common while others become less common. That's evolution by definition. The question isn't whether we're still evolving. The question is whether the evolution we're experiencing now is different from what came before. Whether we've somehow broken free from the normal rules that govern every other species on Earth. To understand if humans have stopped evolving in any meaningful sense, we first need to understand how we got here. Because the story of human evolution isn't a steady march from primitive to advanced. It's a story of rapid changes and long stagnations, of near extinctions and explosive expansions, of environments changing and populations adapting or dying. It's a story that makes sense only when you understand the foundation, the mechanisms of evolution that have been shaping life on Earth for 3.8 billion years, and it's a story that's far from over. Because if there's one thing evolution teaches us, it's that nothing stays the same forever. The world keeps changing, and life, including human life, has to change with it, or face extinction. So let's trace that journey. Let's follow our ancestors from the forests of Africa 7 million years ago to the modern world of cities and smartphones. Let's see how evolution shaped us. And then we can ask the really interesting question, is it still shaping us now? Because here's the thing about leaving the forest. It completely transforms the game. In the trees, you need long arms for swinging, grasping feet for gripping branches, bodies built for climbing. But on the ground, different rules apply, and your ancestors did something almost no other primate had ever done successfully. They stood up. Bipedalism, walking upright on two legs. It sounds simple, but it's actually one of the most revolutionary adaptations in mammalian history. It freed the hands for carrying things, tools, food, infants. It raised the head higher, improving visibility over tall grass. It reduced the body surface exposed to the brutal midday sun, keeping them cooler in the African heat. But it also came with massive costs. Bipedalism made childbirth incredibly difficult because walking upright requires a narrow pelvis, but big-brained babies need a wide birth canal. This created what biologists call the obstetrical dilemma, a fundamental conflict between efficient walking and safe childbirth that humans still struggle with today. It also made the spine vulnerable to injury, created knee and hip problems, and left early bipedal humans slower and more awkward than their quadrupedal competitors. But the advantages outweighed the costs. Over millions of years, natural selection refined the adaptation. Spines curved into the distinctive S shape that absorbs shock. Leg bones thickened and repositioned. Feet developed arches that worked like springs, storing and releasing energy with each step. By 4 million years ago, your ancestors were committed bipeds. They still looked nothing like modern humans, small brains, ape-like faces, but they walked upright as naturally as you do. And that freed them to do something even more important. They started using their hands. Tool use wasn't unique to humans. Chimpanzees use sticks to fish for termites. Crows use tools to extract insects from tree bark. But what your ancestors did was different. They didn't just use tools occasionally. They became completely dependent on them. By 3.3 million years ago, they were deliberately shaping stones into cutting implements, not just picking up convenient rocks, but choosing specific stone types, carrying them to processing sites, and systematically striking them to create sharp edges. This is called the Oldowan tool tradition, and it represents a cognitive leap. You have to understand cause and effect, plan ahead, and have the fine motor control to execute precise strikes. More importantly, you have to teach this skill to your children because it's too complex to learn through simple imitation. This means language, or at least proto-language, was probably emerging. But the real game changer came around 2 million years ago when brain size started increasing rapidly. Your ancestors had been getting smarter slowly for millions of years, but suddenly the pace accelerated. Brain volume doubled, then tripled, from 400 cubic centimeters to 600, then 800, approaching the range of modern humans. This wasn't just more neurons, it was different brain organization. The frontal cortex, responsible for planning, problem-solving, and abstract thinking, expanded dramatically. The temporal lobes, crucial for language processing, grew larger and more complex. The parietal regions, involved in tool use and spatial reasoning, became more sophisticated. But bigger brains came with enormous costs. Brain tissue is metabolically expensive. Your brain is only 2% of your body weight, but it uses 20% of your energy. For early humans with their expanding brains, this created an energy crisis. They needed more calories, better nutrition, more reliable food sources. The solution? They started eating meat, not just scavenging the occasional carcass, but actively hunting. Small animals at first, then progressively larger prey as their technology and cooperation improved. Meat provided concentrated calories and essential nutrients, especially fats crucial for brain development. But hunting required even bigger brains to plan ambushes, coordinate group actions, track animals over long distances. This created a feedback loop. Better nutrition supported bigger brains. Bigger brains enabled better hunting. Better hunting provided more nutrition. round and round, accelerating brain evolution faster than almost anything seen in the fossil record. By 1.8 million years ago, your ancestors had become Homo erectus, the first species that really looked human. Tall, long-legged, built for endurance running, brains approaching 900 cubic centimeters, sophisticated stone tools, and something else, fire. Nobody knows exactly when humans first controlled fire. Evidence is fragmentary, controversial. But by 1 million years ago, maybe earlier, your ancestors were definitely using it systematically. Not just for warmth, though that was important. Not just for protection from predators, though that helped. But for cooking. And cooking changed everything. It pre-digests food, breaking down tough plant fibers and denaturing proteins. This means you can extract more calories from the same amount of food. It also kills parasites and breaks down toxins, making previously inedible foods safe to eat. But most importantly, it reduces the energy required for digestion. Your gut can be smaller, less energetically expensive, freeing up resources for your brain. The archaeological evidence suggests that whenever humans gained systematic control of fire, brain size accelerated shortly afterward. This wasn't coincidence. Cooking enabled the human brain to become what it is today. Homo erectus was incredibly successful. They spread from Africa into Europe and Asia, becoming the first human species to colonize multiple continents. They survived for over 1.5 million years, adapting to environments from tropical Africa to temperate China. But they were still evolving, still changing. In Africa, some Homo erectus populations became what paleoanthropologists call archaic Homo sapiens or Homo heidelbergensis, depending on who's classifying. Brains continued expanding, approaching 1,200 cubic centimeters. Faces became flatter, less projecting. Bodies became more gracile, less robust. Then came the bottleneck, that genetic near extinction we talked about earlier. 930,000 years ago, human populations crashed to perhaps 1,280 breeding individuals. For 117,000 years, they teetered on the edge of extinction. And when they finally recovered around 813,000 years ago, they had been fundamentally transformed. The survivors spread rapidly, colonizing territories that had been empty for millennia. But they weren't spreading as one unified population. They were splitting into the three groups that would become modern humans, Neanderthals and Denisovans. Each followed their own evolutionary path, adapting to different environments, developing unique features. But all carried the genetic signatures of the bottleneck, the fused chromosome, the reduced diversity, the neural adaptations selected for during those desperate years. The African population stayed relatively generalized. They needed adaptability because African environments were still fluctuating, still unpredictable. Natural selection favored intelligence, problem-solving, behavioral flexibility. The populations that moved into Europe faced different challenges. Colder temperatures, extreme seasonality, different prey animals. They became the Neanderthals, robust and cold-adapted, with larger nasal passages and incredibly strong builds. The groups that went east became Denisovans, about whom we know less, but genetic evidence shows they adapted to everything from high-altitude plateaus to tropical islands. For hundreds of thousands of years, these three lineages evolved separately, accumulating differences, developing distinct physical and cultural characteristics. Then, around 300,000 years ago in Africa, something remarkable happened. The African population became anatomically modern, Homo sapiens, us. This wasn't a sudden transformation. It was gradual, regional, complicated. Different modern human traits appeared at different times in different places across Africa. But by 300,000 years ago, there were people in Africa who, if you dressed them in modern clothes, would pass unremarked on any street today. Same height range, same bone structure, same brain size. But here's what's wild. They didn't act modern yet. For the next 200,000 years, these anatomically modern humans used essentially the same stone tools their ancestors had been making for hundreds of thousands of years. They hunted the same way, lived in the same kinds of groups, left the same kinds of archaeological traces. Then around 100,000 years ago, something shifted. Behavioral modernity. Suddenly the archaeological record explodes with innovation, sophisticated art, intricate beadwork, complex projectile weapons, elaborate burial practices, evidence of long-distance trade networks, symbolic artifacts that suggest abstract thinking and possibly religion. What caused this change? Nobody knows for sure. Maybe a genetic mutation improved language abilities. Maybe population growth reached a critical threshold where ideas could spread and build on each other. Maybe climate stress forced innovation. Whatever the trigger, by 70,000 years ago, modern humans were doing things no species had ever done before. They were creating culture that could evolve faster than genes, accumulating knowledge across generations, adapting to new environments through technology and social organization rather than just biological evolution. And then they left Africa. Around 60,000 years ago, a small group, maybe just a few hundred people, crossed from Africa into the Arabian Peninsula. They probably didn't know they were making history. They were just following resources, looking for better territories, doing what humans had always done, moving, exploring, adapting. But this time was different, because these weren't archaic humans anymore. These were modern humans, equipped with advanced technology, complex language, and the cultural toolkit that would let them colonize every environment on Earth. Within just 50,000 years, an eye blink in evolutionary time, their descendants had spread to every continent except Antarctica. They crossed deserts and mountains, paddled across open ocean to Australia, eventually walked across the Bering Land Bridge into the Americas, and everywhere they went they adapted. This is where the last major physical changes happened, the ones we can actually track in historical time. Northern populations developed lighter skin, not because of any inherent superiority, but because of simple physics and biochemistry. Dark skin protects against intense UV radiation, preventing DNA damage and preserving folate, a vitamin crucial for fetal development. In tropical environments, dark skin is essential, but in northern latitudes with weak sun, dark skin becomes a disadvantage. You need UV radiation to produce vitamin D, and if you don't get enough, your bones weaken, your immune system suffers, you're more likely to die before reproducing. So natural selection favored mutations that reduced melanin production. This happened independently in Europe and East Asia, different genetic mutations producing similar results. Convergent evolution in action. The adaptation happened fast, probably within just 10,000 to 20,000 years. Fast enough that we can see it in the genetic record, trace the specific mutations that spread through populations. The same thing happened with lactose tolerance. Originally, all humans were lactose intolerant after weaning, like most mammals. We couldn't digest milk sugar as adults. But when some populations began herding cattle around 10,000 years ago, suddenly there was strong selection pressure for the ability to digest milk. Individuals with mutations that kept lactase enzyme production active into adulthood could extract nutrition from a resource their neighbors couldn't use. They had more children passed on the genes, and within just a few thousand years, lactose tolerance had spread through dairy farming populations across Europe, East Africa, and parts of Asia. This is one of the fastest, most dramatic examples of natural selection in recent human history. We can literally watch it happening in the genetic record. And yet, and this is the puzzle, despite these recent changes, despite clear evidence that natural selection was still acting on human populations just a few thousand years ago, something seems to have changed. Look at your ancestors from 10,000 years ago. They were shorter on average, had different facial structures, often different skull shapes. Go back 50,000 years, and the differences become even more pronounced. Heavier brow ridges, more robust skeletons, different proportions. But look at people from 2,000 years ago, and they're basically identical to us. Same height range, same facial features, same body proportions. The Roman poet Ovid would look perfectly normal in a modern office. Julius Caesar would blend into a crowd. Cleopatra could be anyone you pass on the street. Something happened. Something that seems to have stopped, or at least dramatically slowed, the physical evolution that had been transforming humanity for millions of years. The question is what, and more importantly, why? Because here's the thing, natural selection doesn't just stop. It can't. As long as some individuals reproduce more than others, evolution continues. But the nature of that selection can change dramatically. And for humans, starting around 10,000 years ago, something fundamental shifted in how natural selection acted on our populations. That shift began with the agricultural revolution, and understanding what happened next requires understanding what farming actually did to human evolution. Because the answer isn't what most people think. For millions of years, your ancestors lived the same basic lifestyle. Wake up, find food, don't get eaten, make babies, repeat. They were hunter-gatherers, following animal herds, tracking seasonal plants, moving constantly in small groups of maybe 20 to 50 people. This was the human way of life, not for centuries or millennia, but for literally millions of years. From the earliest proto-humans walking upright on the African savanna to the sophisticated modern humans spreading across the continents, the fundamental survival strategy remained unchanged. Move around, exploit whatever resources you can find, keep your group small enough to feed. Then 10,000 years ago, everything changed, and I mean everything. In a handful of river valleys scattered across the world, humans made a decision that would alter the course of evolution itself. They decided to stop moving. They looked at wild grasses growing along riverbanks and thought, what if instead of travelling to find food, we made the food come to us? What if we stopped chasing animals and started keeping them? What if we built permanent shelters and stayed in one place? It sounds simple, almost obvious in hindsight. But this was the most revolutionary idea in human history. We call it the agricultural revolution, but that name doesn't capture the magnitude of what happened. This wasn't just a new way of getting food. This was humans deciding to take control of nature itself, to reshape the environment to suit our needs instead of adapting ourselves to fit the environment. And here's the really wild part. It happened independently in at least 7 different places around the world. The Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, the Yellow River Valley in China, the highlands of New Guinea, central Mexico, the Andes Mountains, sub-Saharan Africa, the eastern United States. These populations had no contact with each other. They didn't share knowledge or trade ideas, but within a few thousand years of each other, they all made the same fundamental leap. They all figured out that you could plant seeds, harvest the results, save some seeds for next year, and repeat. They all realized you could capture wild animals, keep them in enclosures, breed them selectively, and create a permanent supply of meat, milk, and leather. The first crops were barely recognizable as food. Wild wheat and barley in the Middle East were scrawny grasses with tiny seeds protected by hard shells. Wild rice in China was even worse. Wild corn in Mexico was a scraggly plant called teosinte that produced maybe 5 or 6 small kernels, nothing like the fat golden ears we know today. But early farmers had stumbled onto something more powerful than any tool their ancestors had invented. They had discovered evolution itself, and they were using it as a technology. Every year they saved seeds from the plants that produced the most food, the easiest to harvest, the best tasting. Every generation they bred animals that were most docile, most productive, most useful. They were practicing artificial selection, the same process Darwin would recognize thousands of years later. Except they were doing it without any understanding of genetics or evolution. They just knew what worked. Within just a few thousand years, these early farmers had transformed wild plants and animals into something entirely new. Wheat with enormous seed heads, rice with tender grains that didn't scatter when harvested, corn that produced massive ears packed with hundreds of kernels, cattle that were docile enough to handle but large enough to provide enormous amounts of meat and milk, dogs that would herd sheep instead of hunting them. The archaeological record shows this transformation happening at breathtaking speed. Sites from 9,000 years ago show evidence of plants that are starting to change, becoming slightly larger, slightly more useful. By 7,000 years ago, the transformation is obvious. These aren't wild plants anymore. They're domesticated crops that couldn't survive without human cultivation. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Because while humans were busy evolving their food sources, something else was happening. Something nobody planned or anticipated. Agriculture was creating entirely new selection pressures on humans themselves. Think about what farming actually requires. You need to stay in one place for years, decades, generations. You need to clear land, plant seeds, tend crops for months before you can harvest. You need to store grain for the winter and save seed for next spring. You need to build permanent structures, dig wells, create irrigation systems. Most importantly, you need way more people than a hunter-gatherer band could support. Because here's the thing about farming. It's incredibly labor-intensive. Clearing fields, planting, weeding, harvesting, processing grain, it all takes enormous amounts of work. A hunter-gatherer might spend 20 to 30 hours a week finding food. Early farmers were working 60, 70, maybe 80 hours a week to produce the same number of calories. Sounds terrible, right? Why would anyone choose that? The answer is that farming wasn't about making life easier. It was about making more people possible. 1 acre of farmed land could support 10 to 100 times more people than 1 acre of wild landscape. You could have way more children because you didn't need to carry them while traveling. You could feed them grain mash instead of breast milk, reducing the spacing between births. You could support elderly people who couldn't travel but could still help with farming tasks. Within just a few generations, farming communities were exploding in population. Villages that started with maybe 50 people were growing to 500, then 5,000. The first true cities appeared in Mesopotamia around 6,000 years ago. Uruk, in what's now Iraq, grew to maybe 50,000 people by 5,000 years ago. This was unprecedented. There had never been 50,000 humans living in one place in the entire history of our species. and this population explosion created something humans had never experienced before. Constant, intimate contact with thousands of other people. Hunter-gatherer bands were small enough that everyone knew everyone. If someone got sick, you could avoid them or leave them behind. But in a city of 50,000, you were constantly surrounded by strangers, living in houses that shared walls, drinking water from communal wells, shopping in crowded markets. This was the perfect environment for disease, and disease came with a vengeance. Living in permanent settlements meant living in your own waste. No more moving to a fresh campsite every few weeks. Now human waste accumulated in streets and water supplies. Pathogens that would have died out in small mobile populations could now spread like wildfire through dense urban populations. Even worse, farmers lived in close contact with their animals. Cattle, pigs, sheep, chickens, all crammed into pens and barns, living right alongside human families. This created something that had never existed before. A bridge for diseases to jump from animals to humans. Most of the infectious diseases that plague humanity, measles, smallpox, influenza, tuberculosis, plague, all of them originated in domesticated animals. Measles jumped from cattle. Smallpox probably came from camels or cattle. Influenza from pigs and birds. These diseases couldn't have existed in hunter-gatherer populations. They require large, dense populations to sustain transmission. But in agricultural societies, they flourished. The archaeological evidence is brutal. Skeletons from early farming communities show much higher rates of disease and malnutrition than hunter-gatherer populations. Early farmers were shorter, had worse teeth, showed signs of vitamin deficiencies and chronic infections. Average life expectancy probably dropped when agriculture was adopted. Child mortality rates were horrifying. So why did farming spread? Why did it take over the world if it made people sicker and worked them harder? Because it produced more people. Communities that adopted farming could support larger populations. Larger populations meant more warriors, more labourers, more innovation. When farmers encountered hunter-gatherers, the farmers had superior numbers. They could field armies. They could afford to lose battles and still come back. They could slowly, relentlessly push hunter-gatherers off the best land. Within just a few thousand years, farming had spread across the entire globe. Not because it was better for individual humans, but because it was better for human populations. But here's where the evolutionary story gets really wild. All these new selection pressures, the diseases, the dietary changes, the different lifestyle, they started changing human genetics. Fast. In Europe, populations that had adopted dairy farming faced a problem. Adult humans aren't supposed to digest milk. Like all mammals, we produce an enzyme called lactase as infants to break down milk sugars, but after weaning, lactase production shuts down. Drink milk as an adult and you get sick. Cramps, diarrhea, gas. But European farmers had cattle producing milk year-round. This was potentially thousands of extra calories per day, enormous nutritional value. Any genetic variant that allowed adults to keep producing lactase would provide massive survival advantages. The genetic evidence shows exactly what happened. A mutation that kept lactase production turned on throughout life appeared in European populations. Individuals with this mutation could drink milk without getting sick. They had access to more calories and more nutrition. They had more children who survived to adulthood. Within just a few thousand years, lactose tolerance went from being vanishingly rare to being the dominant trait in Northern European populations. This is evolution happening in fast forward. Not millions of years, not hundreds of thousands. Just a few thousand years, maybe 200 to 300 generations, and a major genetic change swept through entire populations. Similar changes were happening with diet. Farming societies that relied heavily on starchy crops faced different nutritional challenges than meat-heavy hunter-gatherer diets. Populations evolved changes in genes related to starch digestion, vitamin production, and metabolism. In high-altitude farming communities, selection favored genetic variants that helped process oxygen more efficiently in thin air. In malaria-prone regions where agriculture had created standing water perfect for mosquito breeding, selection favored genetic variants that provided some malaria resistance. But here's what makes all this different from everything that came before. For the first time in human history, we weren't just adapting to our environment. We were creating our environment. Every dam we built, every forest we cleared, every animal we domesticated, it changed the selection pressures acting on us. We were caught in a feedback loop. Agriculture changed human genetics. Those genetic changes made us better adapted to agricultural lifestyles. That success encouraged more agriculture, denser populations, more environmental modification, which created new selection pressures, which drove more genetic changes, faster and faster, accelerating over thousands of years. And humans were getting better at controlling their environment with every generation. Early farmers could barely survive crop failures. But over millennia, they developed technologies to manage risk, irrigation systems to control water, storage facilities to save food for bad years, trade networks to move surplus food from productive regions to struggling ones. They learned to predict weather patterns, to recognize signs of drought or flood. They developed social systems to coordinate large-scale projects, to organize labor for building and harvest. Most importantly, they developed knowledge systems to preserve and transmit agricultural expertise. Writing, which appeared in agricultural societies around 5,000 years ago, allowed farmers to record crop yields, track seasons, document successful techniques. For the first time, knowledge could be preserved outside of human memory, passed down through generations without degradation. This was the beginning of humans controlling their own evolution. Not through genetic changes, though those were still happening, but through cultural and technological changes that happened far faster than biological evolution ever could. By 2,000 years ago, the transformation was complete. The entire world, or at least everywhere humans could farm, had been converted to agriculture. Hunter-gatherers survived only in marginal environments, deserts, Arctic regions, dense rainforests, places where farming was impossible, and human populations had exploded to levels that would have been unimaginable to our hunter-gatherer ancestors. Estimates suggest there might have been 300 million humans alive by 2,000 years ago. Remember that bottleneck 900,000 years earlier? Those 1,280 breeding individuals clinging to survival. Their descendants now numbered in the hundreds of millions, and they were living in a world they had created, eating crops they had designed, living in cities they had built, protected by technologies they had invented. For the first time in history, the primary selection pressure on humans wasn't nature. It was other humans. Competition between agricultural societies, warfare, trade, cultural exchange. These were the forces shaping human evolution now. The agricultural revolution had accomplished something no species had ever done before. It had allowed humans to step outside the normal rules of evolution, to create their own environment instead of adapting to nature's demands. But it was just the beginning, because what came next would make the agricultural revolution look like a dress rehearsal. The real transformation was still to come. But then something extraordinary happened. Something that would change the rules of natural selection more profoundly than anything in the previous 7 million years of human evolution. Around 200 years ago, humans invented a way to cheat death, not permanently, not completely, but consistently enough to break the fundamental mechanism that had shaped every living thing since the origin of life itself. We invented modern medicine. Here's what that actually means. For millions of years, natural selection worked through a simple, brutal mechanism. Individuals with genetic variants that made them less fit for their environment died before they could reproduce. Those genes disappeared from the population. Individuals with beneficial variants survived, reproduced, and passed those genes on. Over thousands of generations, this process refined every species, eliminated harmful mutations, selected for advantageous traits. It was automatic, pitiless, utterly indifferent to individual suffering. But it worked. It had created everything from bacteria to blue whales, from fungi to humans. It was the engine of evolution, and it ran on death. Then we figured out how to stop it. Start with something simple: eyeglasses. Before the 13th century, if you were born severely nearsighted or farsighted, you were at a massive disadvantage. You couldn't hunt effectively. You couldn't gather food efficiently. You were more likely to have accidents, less likely to contribute to your community's survival. In hunter-gatherer societies, severe vision problems probably reduced your chances of surviving to reproductive age. Natural selection was actively removing genes for poor vision from the population. Then someone in Italy invented corrective lenses. Suddenly, vision problems became trivial. You put on a piece of ground glass, and you could see as well as anyone else. The selective pressure vanished instantly. People with genes for nearsightedness, farsightedness, astigmatism, they all survived and reproduced at the same rates as people with perfect vision. Those genes that would have been gradually eliminated stayed in the population, spread, multiplied. Today, roughly 75% of adults in developed countries need vision correction. 3/4 of the population carrying genes that would have been selected against for millions of years, and nobody cares. Because we solved the problem technologically, we bypassed evolution entirely. But eyeglasses are just the beginning. They're the simplest, most obvious example of how technology can override natural selection. The real revolution happened in the 20th century, when we figured out how to keep people alive who would have died from conditions far more serious than poor vision. Consider type 1 diabetes. It's a genetic condition where your pancreas can't produce insulin, the hormone that regulates blood sugar. Before 1922, a diagnosis of type 1 diabetes was a death sentence. Children who developed it would waste away over a few months or years. Adults might last slightly longer, but the outcome was always the same: death, usually before reproductive age. Natural selection eliminated genes for type 1 diabetes with ruthless efficiency. Then, in 1922, researchers in Canada discovered how to extract and purify insulin from animal pancreases. Suddenly, type 1 diabetes became manageable, not cured, not eliminated, but manageable. A daily injection could keep blood sugar regulated indefinitely. People with type 1 diabetes could live normal lifespans, have children, pass those genes on to the next generation. The selective pressure vanished overnight. Today, millions of people with type 1 diabetes live full lives, have families, contribute to society. Genes that would have been eliminated from the population 100 years ago are now being actively transmitted to the next generation. Evolution didn't solve the problem. Technology did. Or take antibiotics. This one's even more dramatic. Before 1928, when Alexander Fleming accidentally discovered penicillin, bacterial infections were one of the leading causes of death worldwide. A simple cut could become infected and kill you. Pneumonia, strep throat, tuberculosis. These weren't just inconveniences, they were death sentences. Millions died every year from infections we now consider trivial. Natural selection was constantly testing human populations for resistance to bacterial diseases. People with more robust immune systems survived. Those with weaker immunity died before they could reproduce. Generation by generation, humans were being selected for disease resistance. It was happening slowly, but it was happening. Then we invented antibiotics. Within a few decades, bacterial infections went from being major killers to minor inconveniences. You get strep throat, you take penicillin for a week, you're fine. You develop pneumonia, a course of antibiotics, and you're back at work. The selective pressure disappeared almost completely. People with genetic variants that made them more susceptible to bacterial infections now survive and reproduce at the same rates as those with more robust immunity. The implications are staggering. We're not just preserving individual lives. We're preserving entire categories of genetic variants that natural selection would have eliminated. We're changing the genetic composition of the human species in ways that would have been impossible before modern medicine. But perhaps the most profound impact has been on infant mortality. This is where natural selection hits hardest. Because here's the thing about evolution. It doesn't care about old people. Once you're past reproductive age, natural selection essentially ignores you. But infants and children, that's where the selective pressure is most intense. Any genetic condition that kills children before they can reproduce gets eliminated fast. For most of human history, infant mortality was horrifyingly high. In hunter-gatherer societies, roughly 40% of children died before age 15. In agricultural societies, it was even worse in some periods. 50% or more of children never made it to adulthood. They died from infections, from genetic conditions, from complications during birth, from malnutrition, from accidents. Natural selection was brutal, relentless, constantly culling the population. Then, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, everything changed. Germ theory led to better hygiene, clean water, systems prevented waterborne diseases, vaccination eliminated killers like smallpox and polio, better nutrition improved overall health, medical interventions saved babies who would have died during or shortly after birth. The numbers are almost unbelievable. In 1900, the infant mortality rate in the United States was about 165 deaths per 1,000 live births. Today, it's under 6 per 1,000. We went from losing 1 in 6 babies to losing 1 in 170. In just over a century, we reduced infant mortality by more than 95%. Think about what that means for evolution. For millions of years, roughly half of all humans died before reproducing. Natural selection could work with that. It was a massive filter, constantly removing harmful genetic variants from the population. Now, in developed countries, nearly everyone survives to reproductive age. The filter is gone. Almost every genetic variant, beneficial or harmful, gets passed to the next generation. We've got people with cystic fibrosis living into their 40s and 50s, having children. A generation ago, most died in childhood. We've got people with haemophilia living normal lifespans thanks to clotting factor treatments. We've got people with severe allergies surviving because of EpiPens and emergency medicine. We've got people with congenital heart defects living full lives after surgical repairs. Each of these conditions would have been eliminated by natural selection. Each represents a genetic variant that reduces survival fitness in a natural environment. But we don't live in a natural environment anymore. We live in a medical environment, an environment where technology compensates for genetic vulnerabilities. And it's not just genetic conditions, it's everything. People with weakened immune systems survive thanks to antibiotics and antivirals. People with poor physical fitness survive because they don't need to hunt or gather food. People with mental health conditions survive because of therapy and medication. People with disabilities survive because of assistive technologies and social support systems. The scope is almost impossible to comprehend. We're preserving genetic diversity that evolution would have eliminated. We're keeping variants in the population that would have disappeared thousands of years ago. We're fundamentally altering the genetic trajectory of our species. But here's where it gets complicated. Is this a bad thing? Evolution doesn't have goals. It doesn't optimize for human happiness or societal good. It just selects for reproductive success in a particular environment. A gene that causes suffering but doesn't prevent reproduction isn't selected against. A gene that reduces quality of life but allows survival and breeding sticks around. Natural selection is blind to everything except reproductive fitness. So when we use medicine to preserve genetic variants that would have been eliminated, are we accumulating harmful mutations? Are we degrading the human genome? Some people worry about this. They imagine a future where humans are genetically weaker, more dependent on technology, less able to survive without medical intervention. But that worry misunderstands what's happening. We're not getting weaker. We're changing the environment. For millions of years, human evolution was shaped by a harsh, natural environment where small genetic disadvantages could mean death. Now, we've created an environment where those disadvantages are compensated for technologically. We haven't stopped evolving. We've changed what we're evolving for. Think about it this way. Is someone with type 1 diabetes less fit in an evolutionary sense if they can live a full life, have children, and contribute to society? Only if you define fitness as ability to survive without insulin injections. But that's an arbitrary definition based on a particular environment. In the environment we've actually created, the environment with insulin available, they're just as fit as anyone else. The same logic applies to every medical intervention. We haven't defeated evolution. We've harnessed it. We've created an environment where human cooperation and technological innovation provide survival advantages that outweigh individual genetic vulnerabilities. But there's another layer to this, one that's even more profound. Medical technology doesn't just preserve existing genetic variants, it's creating new selective pressures, different pressures that favor different traits than those favored in our ancestral environment. In a world with modern medicine, individual genetic fitness matters less, but social cooperation matters more. The ability to create and maintain complex technological systems matters more. The capacity for abstract reasoning and long-term planning matters more. We're selecting for different kinds of intelligence, different kinds of social skills. Consider how humans survived before modern medicine. You needed a robust immune system, physical strength, acute senses, high pain tolerance. Those were the traits natural selection favored. Now, those traits still matter, but they matter less. What matters more is the ability to navigate complex social systems, access medical care, understand health information, comply with treatment regimens. We're selecting for social intelligence, for the ability to work within technological systems, for traits that allow individuals to thrive in complex interconnected societies. This isn't the end of evolution. It's a redirection of evolution toward new selective pressures that we've created. And here's the really wild part. We're doing it consciously. For the first time in the history of life on Earth, a species is aware of the evolutionary forces acting on it, and is deliberately modifying those forces. We're not just subject to evolution, we're participants in it. We're shaping our own evolutionary future through the choices we make about medical technology, reproductive decisions, and social organization. But this creates ethical questions that our ancestors never had to face. If we can keep anyone alive regardless of their genetic makeup, should we? If we can select embryos for certain traits, which traits should we select for? If we can edit genes to eliminate diseases, which genes should we edit? These aren't questions about survival anymore. They're questions about values, about what kind of species we want to become. And unlike our ancestors who had to accept whatever hand natural selection dealt them, we have choices, real choices about the genetic future of our species. That's both exhilarating and terrifying, because for the first time we're responsible for our own evolution. The decisions we make in the next few generations will shape human genetics for thousands of years to come. Natural selection hasn't stopped, it's just taken on a new form. Instead of being shaped by environmental pressures we can't control, we're being shaped by the technological and social environments we create. Instead of evolution happening to us, we're making evolution happen, and that changes everything. For millions of years, where you lived determined what you became. If your ancestors stayed in the Arctic, natural selection gave them shorter limbs and stockier builds to conserve heat. If they moved to high altitudes, evolution crafted their blood to carry oxygen more efficiently. If they settled in tropical regions, their bodies adapted to shed heat and resist specific diseases. Geography was destiny. Climate was a selective force as powerful as any predator. Then about 100,000 years ago, something remarkable happened. Humans started cheating. It began simply enough. Animal skins wrapped around bodies, fire brought inside caves, crude shelters built to block wind and rain. Nothing fancy, nothing that would have impressed our modern sensibilities. But these simple innovations fundamentally changed the relationship between humans and their environment. For the first time in evolutionary history, a species was creating its own microclimate. Think about what this means. As Neanderthal living in Ice Age Europe didn't need to wait hundreds of thousands of years for natural selection to give them thicker skin or more efficient metabolism. They just needed to figure out how to keep a fire burning through the night, how to cure animal hides properly, how to build a windbreak that didn't collapse in storms. The selective pressure was shifting from biological adaptation to technological innovation. Fast forward to today. Right now, as you're listening to this, humans are living in places that should absolutely, 100%, kill them within hours. Antarctica, Death Valley, the Sahara Desert, the top of Mount Everest, the bottom of the ocean in research submarines, the International Space Station orbiting 250 miles above Earth's surface. Not just surviving in these places, but living there, working there, some people even choosing to stay there year-round. This shouldn't be possible. Every single one of these environments presents conditions that the naked human body cannot survive. We have no fur for the cold, no specialized respiratory system for thin air, no biological mechanism to handle 130-degree heat or negative 80-degree cold. We're tropical apes. Our bodies are designed for the African savanna, not the Arctic tundra or the Mojave Desert or the vacuum of space. But we're there anyway. Thriving, in fact. How? The answer is layers upon layers of technological adaptation. Clothing isn't just fabric anymore. It's advanced synthetic materials designed to wick moisture while retaining heat, or reflect heat while allowing ventilation, or provide insulation against cold so extreme it would freeze your skin in seconds. We've engineered materials that our evolutionary ancestors couldn't have imagined in their wildest dreams, and clothing is just the beginning. Heating systems let us live comfortably in places where winter temperatures regularly drop to -40 degrees. Not just survive, mind you, but live in heated homes wearing t-shirts and shorts while blizzards rage outside. We've essentially eliminated winter as a selective pressure for huge portions of humanity. Air conditioning has done the same thing for heat. Phoenix, Arizona, has a population of over 1.7 million people. The average summer temperature there is 106 degrees Fahrenheit. Before air conditioning became widespread in the 1950s, Phoenix had maybe 100,000 residents. Now it's one of the fastest growing cities in America. People are voluntarily moving to a desert that would have been considered uninhabitable for permanent settlement throughout most of human history. And they're not suffering. They're not struggling to survive. They're living in climate-controlled comfort. Their homes maintained at a pleasant 72 degrees, while the outside world tries to cook them alive. This is evolution by proxy. We're not adapting our bodies to the environment. We're adapting the environment to our bodies. The implications are staggering. For millions of years, if you lived in the far north, you needed biological cold adaptations. Shorter limbs to reduce heat loss, higher metabolic rates to generate more body heat, different fat distribution. These traits were selected for because individuals without them died before reproducing. The environment killed anyone who wasn't genetically suited to survive it. Now, a person with genetic ancestry from tropical Africa can move to Alaska and live there comfortably for their entire life. They don't need generations of adaptation. They don't need natural selection to reshape their biology. They just need a good coat, a heated home, and modern infrastructure. The selective pressure has vanished. Think about the traditional Inuit peoples of the Arctic. They developed remarkable biological and cultural adaptations to one of Earth's harshest environments. Compact body shapes for heat conservation, cultural knowledge about building igloos, hunting seals, surviving on the ice. This adaptation took thousands of years. Today, anyone with a credit card and internet access can order Arctic survival gear that will keep them alive in the same conditions. No genetic adaptation required, no generational knowledge necessary, just technology. We've effectively decoupled human survival from human biology. But it goes deeper than just temperature control. We're talking about the complete elimination of geographical isolation, the force that has driven speciation throughout evolutionary history. Remember how modern humans, Neanderthals and Denisovans, diverged into separate species. Geographic separation was essential to that process. Populations moved into different environments, faced different selective pressures, and accumulated different genetic changes over hundreds of thousands of years. That can't happen anymore. There are no isolated human populations left. None. Even the most remote communities on Earth, indigenous groups in the Amazon or Papua New Guinea or the Arctic, they're all connected now. Satellite phones, air travel, internet. The genetic isolation that creates new species is impossible in the modern world. More than that, we're mixing, constantly, on a scale that's unprecedented in evolutionary history. A person with ancestry from West Africa can meet someone with ancestry from East Asia, fall in love, and have children together. Those children might then have children with someone of European descent. 3 generations, 3 continents worth of genetic material combined in one family line. This is happening millions of times over, all across the planet, every single day. The result? Humanity is becoming genetically homogenized. Not less diverse exactly, but differently diverse. Instead of having distinct populations with unique genetic characteristics shaped by their local environments, we're creating a global gene pool where ancestries from every continent mix freely. The traditional model of human evolution, populations adapting to local environments, developing distinct traits, potentially diverging into new species, is completely broken. We're not adapting to environments anymore. We're adapting environments to us, and we're doing it so quickly, so effectively, that geography no longer matters as an evolutionary force. Consider this. A person born in Sweden can spend their childhood in Sweden, move to Australia for university, work in Dubai for a decade, retire in Costa Rica, and visit their grandchildren in Japan. Each of these environments has radically different climates: freezing winters, scorching summers, tropical humidity, desert heat. In evolutionary terms, moving between these environments should require genetic adaptation. It should take thousands of generations. Instead, it takes a few hours on an airplane and a suitcase full of appropriate clothing. We've replaced biological evolution with technological evolution, and technological evolution operates on a completely different timescale. Biological evolution takes generations. A beneficial mutation appears, spreads slowly through a population over thousands of years, eventually becomes common if it provides enough survival advantage. It's glacially slow. Technological evolution takes years, sometimes months. Someone invents a better heating system, and within a decade it's in millions of homes. A new fabric is developed that provides better insulation, and within a generation it's replaced the old standard everywhere. We're evolving, but we're doing it outside our bodies. This represents something genuinely unprecedented in the history of life on Earth. No other species has ever decoupled its survival from its biology so completely. Polar bears need biological cold adaptation. They can't just put on a coat. Camels need biological heat adaptation. They can't install air conditioning. But humans, we've essentially made ourselves climate-proof. Temperature is no longer a factor in our survival or reproduction. We've neutralized what was once one of the most powerful selective pressures in evolution, and we did it so recently. Air conditioning only became widespread in the last 70 years. Modern insulated housing only in the last century. Commercial air travel connecting all continents only since the 1960s. In evolutionary terms, this happened yesterday. Literally in the blink of an eye compared to the timescales evolution usually operates on. The question now is, what does this mean for our future? We've eliminated climate as a selective pressure. We've eliminated geographic isolation as a mechanism for speciation. We've created a global gene pool that's constantly mixing. We've replaced biological adaptation with technological adaptation. We're living in a moment that has never existed before in the 4 billion year history of life on Earth. A species that has completely freed itself from environmental constraints, that can thrive anywhere and everywhere. That has turned evolution from a biological process into a technological one. Our ancestors survived the genetic bottleneck by adapting to harsh environments. They diverged into different species because geography separated them and different climates shaped them. They evolved larger brains to solve environmental challenges. Now we've solved the environmental challenges permanently. We don't need to adapt to Antarctica because we can bring the tropics with us in the form of heated bases. We don't need to adapt to the desert because we can create artificial oases with air conditioning and imported water. We've made ourselves evolution-proof, at least when it comes to climate. The world our ancestors lived in was one where environment determined survival, where climate shaped bodies, where geography created new species. The world we live in now, environment is irrelevant, climate is controlled, geography is connected. We're not just a different species from our evolutionary ancestors, we're playing by completely different rules. Rules that evolution has never encountered before, and nobody knows what happens next. For almost 60,000 years after modern humans left Africa, something remarkable happened. The small populations that spread across the globe began adapting to their new environments. The people who settled in East Asia developed different physical characteristics than those who remained in Africa. Europeans evolved lighter skin to capture more vitamin D in cloudy northern climates. Tibetans developed unique oxygen processing capabilities for high-altitude living. Australian Aboriginal populations adapted to the intense solar radiation of the outback. This was evolution doing what it does best. Take isolated populations, expose them to different environments, wait thousands of generations, and you get variation. Not different species. Humans never became isolated enough for that long, but distinct populations with unique genetic signatures shaped by their local environments. A person from Sweden looked different from a person from Kenya, who looked different from a person from Japan. Not because they were fundamentally different. All humans remained one species, capable of interbreeding, sharing 99.9% of their DNA, but because 60,000 years of geographic isolation had allowed local adaptations to emerge. By the year 1500, humanity had reached peak genetic regionalization. Populations on different continents had been largely separate for millennia. Sure, there was some mixing at the borders. Trade routes connected distant regions. Occasional migrations brought new genes into established populations. But for the most part, if you were born in a particular region, your ancestors had been there for hundreds of generations, and your descendants would be there for hundreds more. The genetic distance between a European and an East Asian, measured by the accumulation of unique genetic variants, was the greatest it had ever been in modern human history. We were one species, but we were as close to becoming multiple subspecies as we'd been since Neanderthals and Denisovans disappeared. Then something unprecedented happened. Something that would reverse 60,000 years of evolutionary divergence in just a few centuries. The age of exploration began. Portuguese sailors reached India. Spanish conquistadors discovered the Americas. Dutch merchants established trading posts in Indonesia. British colonizers spread across Australia and Africa. In the span of just a few generations, every inhabited continent on Earth became connected by regular sea travel, and people started moving, not just explorers and traders, but settlers, slaves, refugees, and fortune seekers. Millions of individuals, crossing oceans, establishing new populations far from their ancestral homes, and most importantly, having children with people from completely different genetic backgrounds. This was something genuinely new in human evolution, population mixing on a scale and speed that had never occurred before. Europeans who had adapted to cold climates for 40,000 years were having children with Africans adapted to tropical heat. East Asians whose ancestors had been isolated for millennia were interbreeding with indigenous Americans. Indians were mixing with Europeans, Africans with Asians, creating genetic combinations that hadn't existed since the original human expansion out of Africa. But the age of exploration was just the beginning. If ocean travel connected the continents, what came next would dissolve the boundaries between them entirely. The 19th century brought steamships that could cross oceans in weeks instead of months. The 20th century brought airplanes that could do it in hours. And then came something even more revolutionary: the systematic dismantling of legal barriers to human movement. Not everywhere, not all at once, and certainly not without resistance and conflict. But gradually, over the course of the 20th century, large-scale international migration became normalized in ways that would have been unthinkable to our ancestors. By the year 2000, there were approximately 150 million international migrants worldwide, people living in countries other than where they were born. By 2020, that number had more than doubled to 280 million. Think about what this means genetically. 280 million people living outside their ancestral homelands, forming families, having children with partners from different genetic backgrounds. That's roughly 3.6% of the entire human population actively participating in genetic mixing across traditional geographic boundaries. But even that number massively understates what's really happening. Because it's not just international migrants who are mixing populations, it's internal migration within large diverse countries. It's the urbanization that brings people from different regions into the same cities. It's the breaking down of social barriers between ethnic groups who live in the same territory. In the United States, interracial marriage was literally illegal in many states until 1967. Today, roughly 20% of newlyweds are in interracial or interethnic marriages. In Brazil, centuries of mixing between Portuguese, African and indigenous populations have created one of the most genetically diverse populations on Earth. In Singapore, Chinese, Malay, Indian and European populations interact and intermarry daily in one of the world's most cosmopolitan cities. This is happening everywhere: London, Toronto, Dubai, Sydney. Cities that have become genetic melting pots where people from dozens of different ancestral populations live, work, and form families together. The genetic isolation that created distinct regional populations is collapsing. Not slowly, not gradually, but at a pace that makes the original spread of humans out of Africa look leisurely by comparison. And here's where it gets really interesting. This mixing is doing two seemingly contradictory things at once. It's both increasing genetic diversity within local populations and decreasing genetic diversity globally. Let me explain. When humans first spread across the globe, each regional population became less genetically diverse than the African population they came from. This is called the founder effect. A small group leaves, carrying only a subset of the total genetic variation. That group expands, and the new population they create has less overall diversity than the original population. So a person of European descent has slightly less genetic diversity than a person of African descent. An East Asian person has slightly less than both. This isn't about superiority, it's just mathematics. Each migration out of Africa represented a sampling of existing diversity, and each sampling lost a little bit of variation. But when populations that have been separate for thousands of generations start mixing, something remarkable happens. The children of these unions inherit genetic variants from both parents, variants that evolved independently in separate populations, variants that would never have existed in the same individual without modern migration patterns. These individuals often have more genetic diversity than either of their parents' populations. They're carrying genetic combinations that are literally unprecedented in human history. In this sense, genetic diversity within populations is increasing dramatically. The child of a Norwegian and a Nigerian parent has access to genetic variants from two populations that diverged 60,000 years ago. But at the same time, the genetic distance between populations is shrinking. Those unique variants that made European populations genetically distinct are spreading into African populations through mixed individuals. Asian variants are spreading into European populations. African variants are spreading into Asian populations. Over generations, this process homogenizes human genetic diversity. Instead of having distinct regional populations with unique genetic signatures, we're moving toward a global population where most genetic variants are present everywhere, just at different frequencies. The unique adaptations that took thousands of years to develop are being diluted. The specific genetic variants that help Tibetans process oxygen at high altitude, they're spreading into lowland populations through migration and intermarriage. The skin color adaptations that evolved in response to different levels of UV radiation, they're mixing and recombining in ways that make simple categorization increasingly meaningless. Within a few dozen generations, maybe less, the concept of genetically distinct human populations might become obsolete. Not because we've stopped evolving, but because the rate of genetic exchange between populations now far exceeds the rate at which new local adaptations can develop. Think about that. For 60,000 years, human evolution was driven partly by geographic isolation. Populations adapted to local conditions because they were separated long enough for natural selection to work. But what happens when separation no longer exists? When any genetic innovation that appears anywhere in the human population can spread globally within a few generations? We become, for the first time in 60,000 years, truly one population again. Not just one species, we've always been that, but one interbreeding population without significant genetic barriers or isolation. We're undoing the divergence that began when the first humans walked out of Africa. And it's not just genes that are mixing. Culture is flowing across borders at unprecedented speeds. A person in Tokyo can listen to music from Lagos, watch movies from Hollywood, eat cuisine from Mexico, and learn philosophy from India, all before lunch. Ideas, technologies, artistic styles, and social innovations spread globally in days or weeks instead of centuries or millennia. This cultural exchange reinforces the genetic mixing. When people share cultural references, speak common languages, and participate in global communication networks. The social barriers that once kept populations separate dissolve. Your children are more likely to form relationships with people from different backgrounds when they share cultural touchstones, when they grew up watching the same shows, playing the same games, speaking the same languages. The internet has accelerated this beyond anything imaginable even 50 years ago. A person anywhere in the world with an internet connection has access to essentially all of human culture. They can learn any language, study any tradition, communicate with people on any continent. Geographic isolation, the force that drove human diversity for 60,000 years, has been almost completely eliminated for large portions of humanity. But here's what's really wild about all this. We're running an evolutionary experiment that has never been tried before. No other species has deliberately and systematically broken down the geographic barriers that create population structure. No other species has mixed isolated populations at this scale and speed. We don't actually know what will happen. Will we see an explosion of hybrid vigor as beneficial genes from different populations combine? Will we lose important adaptations that took millennia to develop? Will new selection pressures emerge that favor certain genetic combinations over others? The most likely scenario is that humanity is becoming more genetically uniform but not less diverse. That sounds contradictory, but it's not. We're moving toward a future where most genetic variants exist in most populations, but where individuals vary enormously based on which specific combinations of variants they inherit. Instead of genetic variation being organized geographically, with different populations having different typical characteristics, variation will be organized individually. Any person might inherit any combination of the genetic variants that currently exist somewhere in the human population. The child of two parents with mixed ancestry might look completely different from their siblings, expressing different combinations of variants from their diverse genetic heritage. In essence, we're shuffling the human genetic deck more thoroughly than it's been shuffled since the bottleneck 900,000 years ago. We're creating the conditions for a new kind of human diversity, not regional, not tied to geography or ancestry, but individual and unpredictable. And we're doing it faster than natural selection can keep up. The mixing is happening over generations and centuries, while natural selection usually takes thousands or tens of thousands of years to produce significant changes. We're evolving, but not through selection. We're evolving through recombination, through the mixing and matching of existing genetic variants in novel combinations. This is genuinely unprecedented, and it raises a fascinating question. In a world without geographic isolation, without significant genetic barriers between populations, without the local selection pressures that drove human diversity for 60,000 years, what does human evolution even look like? The answer might surprise you. So here's the question that probably brought you to this video in the first place. After everything we've discussed, agriculture, medicine, climate control, the global mixing of populations, are humans still evolving? Or have we really stopped? The answer is going to surprise you. Because here's the thing, evolution never stops. It can't. As long as there's reproduction, as long as some individuals have more surviving offspring than others, as long as there's genetic variation in a population, evolution is happening. It's not a process you can turn off like a light switch. It's an inevitable consequence of how life works. But, and this is a massive but, the way humans are evolving now is completely different from how we evolved for millions of years. The selection pressures have changed, the mechanisms have shifted, the speed has altered in ways that would blow Darwin's mind. Let's start with the evidence that evolution hasn't stopped at all. It's just gotten weird. Your wisdom teeth. Right now, as you're listening to this, there's about a 35% chance you're missing at least one of them. Not because a dentist removed it, but because your body never bothered to develop it in the first place. Your ancestors 10,000 years ago had a near 100% chance of having all 4 wisdom teeth. Today, more than a third of humans are born without the full set. Some people, about 1 in 20, don't develop any wisdom teeth at all. This is evolution happening in real time. Natural selection is removing wisdom teeth from the human population because we don't need them anymore. Our agricultural diet is softer. Our processed food doesn't require the massive grinding power that our hunter-gatherer ancestors needed. Wisdom teeth have become obsolete. And when traits become obsolete, evolution tends to get rid of them, especially if they cause problems. And wisdom teeth definitely cause problems. Impacted wisdom teeth, infections, crowding, all complications that can reduce reproductive fitness, even if only slightly. Individuals born without wisdom teeth avoid these complications entirely. Over hundreds of generations, the genes for wisdom tooth development are slowly being selected against. It's subtle, it's gradual, but it's happening. Evolution in action. Or consider your appendix. That little organ attached to your large intestine that seems to exist only to occasionally get infected and require emergency surgery. Turns out it used to be much larger in our ancestors. Australopithecus had an appendix proportionally 3 times the size of ours. Over the last 3 million years, human evolution has been steadily reducing it. But here's what's fascinating. It hasn't disappeared completely. Recent research suggests the appendix might actually serve a function as a reservoir for beneficial gut bacteria. When you get sick with diarrheal diseases that flush out your intestinal flora, the appendix can help reseed your gut with the right bacteria afterward. In environments where these diseases are common, the appendix provides a real survival advantage. In modern sanitized environments where such diseases are rare, it's largely unnecessary. So, natural selection is caught in this middle ground, maintaining the appendix in some populations, continuing to reduce it in others. Different populations are evolving in different directions based on their specific environmental pressures. That's evolution. Then there's lactose tolerance. This one's a recent development, evolutionarily speaking. About 10,000 years ago, exactly 0 adult humans could digest milk without getting sick. Lactase, the enzyme that breaks down lactose, stopped being produced after childhood in all human populations. But when some groups started herding cattle and sheep, a mutation appeared that kept the lactase gene turned on into adulthood. And this mutation was so advantageous, providing access to a rich calorie and protein source that didn't require killing your livestock, that it spread incredibly rapidly. Today, about 35% of the global population has lactase persistence. In northern European populations that have been dairy farming for millennia, it's over 90%. In East Asian populations that traditionally didn't rely on dairy, it's less than 10%. This is one of the fastest known examples of human evolution, a trait going from 0 to 35% of the population in just 10,000 years, maybe 400 generations. That's evolutionary lightning speed. And it happened entirely within the agricultural period, within recorded human history. Evolution didn't stop. It adapted to new circumstances. Or look at disease resistance. HIV has only been infecting humans since the 1970s. That's barely 2 generations. But already, evolution is responding. There's a genetic variant called CCR5 delta 32, a mutation that makes cells resistant to HIV infection. It was already present in some European populations before HIV appeared, probably selected for by some other disease in the past, but now it's being strongly selected for in populations with high HIV exposure. Studies show that in some African populations severely affected by HIV, the frequency of protective genetic variants has increased measurably in just the last 40 years. Natural selection operating on a timescale of decades, not millennia. High-altitude populations provide another dramatic example. Tibetan populations have lived at extreme elevations for thousands of years. They've developed genetic variants that help their bodies process oxygen more efficiently in thin air. These variants are so effective that Tibetan women living at high altitude have higher birth weights and lower infant mortality than Han Chinese women who've recently moved to the same elevations. This adaptation happened in less than 3,000 years. We know this because genetic analysis shows the selection signatures are recent. Evolution proceeding at a pace that would have seemed impossible to early 20th century biologists. But here's where it gets really interesting. because while biological evolution is still happening, it's being massively outpaced by cultural evolution. And cultural evolution operates on completely different principles. Biological evolution requires genetic changes that get passed to offspring and then selected for or against over many generations. It's slow. Even the fastest known examples take thousands of years. Cultural evolution works through learning and imitation. A good idea can spread through an entire population in a single generation. A technological innovation can change how millions of people live within decades. Think about smartphones. They didn't exist 30 years ago. Now billions of humans carry them constantly. Our behavior, our social interactions, even our brain development patterns have been altered by this technology in less than one generation. No genetic change required. Pure cultural evolution. This creates a strange situation where humans are adapting to their environment faster than ever before, but mostly through cultural rather than biological means. We don't evolve fur to survive in cold climates, we invent clothing and heating. We don't evolve different digestive systems to handle different foods. We invent cooking techniques and food processing methods. Cultural evolution has become so powerful that it actually shields us from many biological selection pressures. This doesn't stop biological evolution, but it does change which traits get selected for. And this is where things get subtle, because the selection pressures that remain are often unexpected. Take intelligence. You might think modern society would select for higher intelligence. Smarter people are more successful, earn more money, have more resources, but the relationship between intelligence and reproductive success in modern populations is actually slightly negative in many developed countries. People with more education tend to have fewer children on average. Does this mean humans are evolving to become less intelligent? Not necessarily. The relationship is complicated by many factors: delayed reproduction, access to birth control, cultural values about family size, and intelligence itself is influenced by hundreds of genes plus enormous environmental effects, making it resistant to rapid evolutionary change. But it does mean we can't assume evolution is pushing humans in any particular direction. The selection pressures are complex, often contradictory, and frequently changing faster than evolution can respond. Sexual selection is still operating, though. Humans still choose mates based on preferences, and those preferences can drive evolutionary change. Studies show that certain traits are consistently preferred across cultures. Symmetrical faces, markers of good health, traits associated with intelligence and social competence. Over many generations, sexual selection for these traits could shift human populations in subtle ways. Not dramatically, not quickly, but consistently. The humans of 50,000 years from now might be slightly more symmetrical, slightly healthier looking on average, not because of survival advantages, but because of mate choice. But there's another mechanism of evolution operating that most people don't know about: genetic drift. In small populations, natural selection is the dominant force. Beneficial mutations spread, harmful ones disappear. But in large populations, random chance plays a bigger role. Neutral mutations, changes that neither help nor harm, can spread just by luck. And the human population is enormous. 8 billion people and growing. At this scale, genetic drift can cause significant evolutionary changes without any selection pressure at all. Random fluctuations in gene frequencies, amplified over generations, leading to changes that have nothing to do with survival or reproduction advantages. This means some of the ways humans will be different in the future might be completely unpredictable. Random genetic changes that spread through the population simply because they happened to be present in individuals who had lots of descendants. Evolution without purpose, change without direction. Then there's epigenetics, which has completely revolutionized how we think about inheritance. Turns out DNA sequences aren't the only things that get passed to offspring. Chemical modifications to DNA, patterns of gene expression, even RNA molecules can be inherited and can affect how traits develop. Your grandmother's diet during pregnancy might have affected which of your genes are active. Your grandfather's exposure to stress might have changed how your body responds to stress today. Experiences don't change your DNA sequence, but they can change how that DNA gets used, and those changes can be passed down. This is inheritance of acquired characteristics, something Darwin thought was impossible, but it's real, and it's adding a whole new layer to human evolution. We're not just evolving through changes in DNA sequences, but through changes in how those sequences get read and expressed. Epigenetic changes can happen much faster than genetic mutations. Within 1 or 2 generations, populations can show adaptive responses to new environmental conditions through epigenetic mechanisms. This means human evolution might be happening even faster than we thought, just through channels we only recently discovered. So where does all this leave us? Are humans evolving or not? The answer is yes, absolutely, without question. But we're evolving in ways that are different from how any species has evolved before. We're experiencing weak selection pressure for traditional survival traits because culture and technology have buffered us from many environmental challenges. But we're experiencing strong selection for disease resistance, particularly for new diseases. We're adapting through epigenetic mechanisms to modern diets, pollution, stress, and other novel environmental factors. We're undergoing sexual selection based on complex social and cultural preferences. We're experiencing genetic drift at a scale unprecedented in our evolutionary history. And perhaps most importantly, we're evolving culturally at speeds that make biological evolution look glacial by comparison. The humans of the future will be different from us. Not dramatically different, probably. Not noticeably different if we could meet them, but genuinely different in subtle ways we can only partially predict. We might have fewer wisdom teeth, smaller appendixes, different disease resistance profiles. We might have different patterns of gene expression adapted to modern environmental stressors. We might have genetic variants that help us process modern diets or resist modern diseases. But the really big changes, the ones that will most dramatically affect how future humans live, will probably be cultural. New technologies, new social organizations, new ways of thinking about the world. These spread through learning and imitation, through cultural transmission, far faster than genes ever could. This is the new reality of human evolution. A species that's still changing biologically, but changing culturally at a pace that would have seemed like science fiction to our ancestors. We haven't stopped evolving, we've just added new dimensions to how evolution works, and that might be the most remarkable adaptation of all. We've evolved the ability to evolve through multiple mechanisms simultaneously. Genetic changes on a timescale of thousands of years, epigenetic changes on a timescale of generations, and cultural changes on a timescale of years or even months. No other species does this. No other species has ever done this. We've created an evolutionary system so flexible, so responsive, that we can adapt to almost any challenge, whether through our genes, our gene expression, or our culture. This is what makes humans unique. Not that we've stopped evolving, but that we've learned to evolve in so many different ways at once. The question isn't whether we're still evolving. The question is where this evolutionary flexibility is taking us next. And that's a question with no simple answer, because we're writing that answer ourselves with every choice we make, every technology we develop, every idea we share. The future of human evolution isn't predetermined, it's participatory, and we're all part of it right now, whether we realize it or not. So here's where things get really interesting. We've spent this entire journey looking backward, tracing the path that brought us from tree-dwelling primates to smartphone-wielding masters of the planet. We've seen how evolution shaped us for millions of years, then watched as we systematically dismantled nearly every selection pressure that had been driving our species forward. Agriculture, medicine, climate control, global migration, all of it working to buffer us from the forces that has been sculpting human biology since the beginning. But evolution doesn't just stop. It can't. As long as humans are reproducing, as long as some individuals have more surviving offspring than others, evolution is happening. The question isn't whether we're still evolving. The question is what comes next. And that answer is more complex, more fascinating, and potentially more world-changing than anything that's come before. Because for the first time in the history of life on Earth, one species has the ability to deliberately guide its own evolution. We're standing at a threshold that no organism has ever crossed. We can read our own genetic code. We can edit it. We can potentially redesign ourselves from the ground up. The question isn't whether this will happen. It's already happening. The question is where it leads. Let's start with what's already here. Right now, today, scientists can use a technology called CRISPR to edit human DNA with unprecedented precision. Think of it like this. For billions of years, evolution has been editing the genetic code through random mutation and natural selection. A cosmic game of trial and error where most trials fail and success is measured in millions of deaths. CRISPR changes everything. It lets us make specific targeted changes to DNA, not random, not evolutionary, deliberate. In 2018, a Chinese scientist used CRISPR to edit the genes of 2 human embryos, creating the first genetically modified babies. He was trying to make them resistant to HIV by deleting a specific gene. The international community was horrified. He was sentenced to prison. But the genie was already out of the bottle. The technology exists. The knowledge exists. And once knowledge exists, it spreads. Right now, there are dozens of clinical trials using gene therapy to treat genetic diseases. Sickle cell anemia, muscular dystrophy, certain forms of blindness. These aren't science fiction scenarios. These are real treatments being given to real patients. We're literally rewriting the human genetic code to eliminate diseases that have plagued us for millennia. And it's working. But here's where it gets complicated. Once you can edit genes to cure disease, the line between therapy and enhancement becomes extremely blurry. If you can fix a gene that causes early onset Alzheimer's, can you also enhance genes that improve memory in healthy people? If you can correct genes that cause muscle wasting, can you create genes that build stronger muscles? If you can eliminate genetic variants that increase disease risk, can you add variants that increase intelligence, athletic ability, or lifespan? The answer is yes. Technically, all of these things are possible. Not today, not yet, but soon. Maybe within your lifetime. And when that happens, human evolution will split into 2 distinct paths. Natural evolution, the slow, random process that's been shaping life for billions of years, and directed evolution, the fast, intentional redesign of our own species. Think about what that means. For the first time in history, evolution would be driven not by environmental pressures, but by human choices. Not by what helps us survive, but by what we think we want. Not by nature, but by economics, culture, and individual preference. Some people will embrace genetic enhancement. Others will reject it. Some nations will regulate it heavily. Others will treat it like a free market. Within a few generations, you could have human populations that are genetically diverging faster than any speciation event in our history. Here's a scenario. It's 100 years from now. Gene editing has become routine, but expensive. Wealthy families can afford comprehensive genetic enhancement for their children. Better disease resistance, enhanced cognitive ability, optimized metabolism, longer lifespan. Meanwhile, most of the population can't afford these enhancements. They're stuck with their natural genome, subject to all the diseases and limitations that humans have always faced. After just a few generations, the genetic gap becomes enormous. The enhanced humans aren't just slightly better off. They're fundamentally different. They live longer, think faster, rarely get sick. They start to see unenhanced humans the way we might view Neanderthals, related, similar, but somehow less. Within a few more generations, the two groups might not be able to interbreed successfully anymore. You'd have two human species, diverging not because of geography or climate, but because of wealth and technology. This isn't science fiction. This is a plausible outcome based on technologies that already exist, and it's just one possible future. There are others. Consider space colonization. Right now, plans are underway to establish permanent human settlements on Mars within the next few decades. Maybe that happens, maybe it doesn't. But eventually, if we survive long enough, humans will live on other worlds, and when that happens, evolution kicks back into high gear. Mars has 1/3 Earth's gravity, lower atmospheric pressure, intense radiation. Anyone living there permanently would face selection pressures unlike anything humans have experienced in our entire evolutionary history. Within just a few generations, Martian colonists would start adapting. Taller, lighter bone structure to handle low gravity, enhanced radiation resistance, different lung capacity for the thin atmosphere. After thousands of years, Martian humans might look substantially different from Earth humans. After tens of thousands of years, they might be a different species entirely. And Mars is just the beginning. If humans spread to different planets, moons, and orbital habitats, each with unique environmental conditions, you'd get explosive evolutionary radiation. Just like those post-bottleneck humans splitting into modern humans, Neanderthals and Denisovans, future humans could split into dozens of species, each adapted to different worlds. You could have low-gravity humans, high-radiation humans, zero-gravity humans who never set foot on planets, all descended from the same Earth-based ancestors, all carrying the genetic signature of those 1,280 bottleneck survivors, but all evolving along radically different paths. But here's what makes this even more interesting. We don't have to wait for natural selection to adapt us to new environments. We can use genetic engineering to pre-adapt. Want to colonize a high-radiation environment? Edit in DNA repair genes from extremophile bacteria. Want to survive on a planet with a different atmospheric composition? Modify hemoglobin to bind oxygen more efficiently. Want to live in zero gravity without bone loss? Edit the genes that regulate bone density. This creates a feedback loop, unlike anything evolution has ever produced. Technology drives humans into new environments, which creates selection pressures, which drives technological innovation to overcome those pressures, which enables expansion into even more extreme environments, which creates even stronger selection pressures. It's evolution on fast forward, guided by intelligence and accelerated by technology. But let's not forget Earth, because while we're talking about Mars colonies and genetic enhancement, the planet where humans actually live is changing faster than at any point in the last 800,000 years. Climate change isn't just an environmental crisis, it's an evolutionary pressure, and it's hitting us right now. Over the next century, Earth's climate will shift dramatically. Some regions will become uninhabitable due to heat and drought. Others will become more livable as ice sheets retreat and new lands open up. Coastlines will change, weather patterns will shift. Entire ecosystems will collapse and new ones will emerge, and humans will have to adapt. Not over hundreds of thousands of years like the bottleneck, over decades. Now we've got technology to buffer us from most of this. Air conditioning, irrigation, seawalls, genetically modified crops that can handle temperature extremes. But technology isn't distributed equally. Most humans won't have access to the best adaptive technologies. They'll have to survive the old-fashioned way through biology and behavior. In regions where heat becomes extreme, natural selection will favor individuals with better heat tolerance, enhanced sweating capacity, more efficient water retention, genetic variants that protect against heat stroke. In areas where disease vectors shift and new pathogens emerge, selection will favor stronger immune systems. In regions where food becomes scarce, selection might favor more efficient metabolism, smaller body size, lower caloric requirements. These changes won't be dramatic at first, just subtle shifts in gene frequencies, happening too slowly to notice in real time. But over thousands of years they could accumulate into significant adaptations. Humans in different climate zones could start developing distinct characteristics, not as dramatically as the 3 human species after the bottleneck, but measurably different nonetheless. Unless, of course, we use genetic engineering to adapt faster than climate can change. Which brings us full circle back to the question of directed evolution. Should we guide our own evolution? Do we even have a choice anymore? Here's the philosophical knot we're tied in. Natural evolution is blind, cruel, and incredibly wasteful. It works through death. The individuals who aren't well adapted die. The ones who are well adapted survive and reproduce. Over millions of generations, this produces beautiful complexity, but at the cost of unimaginable suffering. Every successful species is built on a mountain of extinction events, failed adaptations, and individual deaths. Directed evolution promises to skip all that suffering. We can adapt ourselves deliberately, intelligently, without waiting for natural selection to slowly kill off everyone who doesn't carry the right mutations. We can eliminate genetic diseases, enhance beneficial traits, adapt to new environments without going through thousands of generations of brutal selection. But directed evolution also means giving up something fundamental. The randomness, the blind exploration of possibility space that natural evolution provides. Natural selection doesn't have goals. It doesn't optimize for what we think we want. It just adapts organisms to survive in whatever environment they're in. Sometimes that produces unexpected solutions, beautiful adaptations we never would have thought to design. If we take over our own evolution, we're limited by our own imagination and understanding. We can only select for traits we recognize as valuable. We can only optimize for goals we can articulate. What if there are aspects of humanity we can't see, can't measure, but are crucial for our long-term survival? What if in our rush to eliminate disease and enhance ability, we accidentally delete genetic diversity that would have been essential for some future challenge we haven't encountered yet? This is the evolutionary equivalent of monoculture farming. When you plant a field with a single crop variety optimized for maximum yield, it's incredibly productive, until a new disease emerges that your crop has no resistance to. Then you lose everything. Natural diversity, even the seemingly useless or harmful variants, provides insurance against unknown future threats. So here's the scenario playing out right now. We have the technology to guide our own evolution. We're already using it to treat genetic diseases. Soon we'll be able to use it for enhancement. Meanwhile, natural evolution continues in the background, subtle and slow but never stopping. Climate change is creating new selection pressures. Global migration is mixing populations. New diseases are emerging, and we're responding with a combination of technology, medicine, and social innovation. The future of human evolution isn't one path. It's multiple paths running in parallel. Some populations will embrace genetic enhancement and deliberately modify themselves. Others will reject it and continue evolving naturally. Some will colonize other worlds and adapt to alien environments. Others will stay on Earth and adapt to a changing climate. Some will merge with technology, augmenting their bodies with artificial implants and brain-computer interfaces. Others will remain purely biological. Over the next 10,000 years, these different paths could produce remarkable diversity. Humans adapted to different planets, enhanced humans with dramatically extended lifespans, cyborg humans merging biology and technology, and yes, unmodified humans continuing the evolutionary journey that's been running for millions of years. All of them would be human, all descended from the same ancestors, but potentially different enough that interbreeding becomes difficult or impossible. Over the next million years, the possibilities become almost impossible to predict. You could have hundreds of human species spread across the solar system and beyond. You could have humans that have merged so completely with artificial intelligence that the distinction between biological and technological becomes meaningless. You could have humans that have eliminated aging entirely, living for thousands or millions of years. You could even have humans that have re-engineered themselves so dramatically that they bear little resemblance to their Earth-based ancestors. Or, and this is important to remember, you could have none of that. Because extinction is still on the table. It's always on the table. 99% of all species that have ever existed are now extinct. Humans are clever, adaptable, and technologically sophisticated. But we're not immortal, not as individuals and not as a species. Climate change, nuclear war, pandemic disease, asteroid impact, artificial intelligence gone wrong. There are plenty of ways our story could end suddenly, with all our technological prowess and genetic knowledge unable to save us. But if we survive, if we navigate the challenges of the next few centuries and make it to the other side, the future of human evolution is limited only by physics and imagination. We could become something our ancestors wouldn't recognize, something they might not even understand as human, and that's not necessarily bad. Evolution has always been about change, about adaptation, about becoming something new in response to new challenges. For 4 billion years, evolution on Earth was driven by mutation, selection, and time. Slow, blind, beautiful in its complexity but brutal in its mechanism. Then one species, one lineage of African apes who survived a catastrophic genetic bottleneck, developed intelligence, technology, and the ability to understand the very process that created them. Now we're standing at the threshold. Behind us 4 billion years of natural evolution, the slow accumulation of changes that transformed single cells into complex conscious beings. Ahead of us, an unknown future where evolution might be guided by intelligence, accelerated by technology, and shaped by choices we haven't even imagined yet. Are we still evolving? Yes, absolutely, without question. But the nature of that evolution is changing faster than evolution itself ever has before. We're not just products of evolution anymore, we're participants, partners, potentially directors. We're living through the most dramatic transition in the history of life on Earth, the moment when evolution becomes aware of itself and begins choosing its own direction. And that's simultaneously terrifying and awe-inspiring. We might screw it up completely. Make choices that doom our species or split humanity into warring factions based on genetic modification. Or we might create something beautiful. A future where humans, in whatever form we take, spread across the cosmos and continue the evolutionary journey that began in African valleys 7 million years ago. The only certainty is this: evolution isn't over. It's never over. As long as life reproduces, evolution continues. The question we face now isn't whether evolution stops. It's what comes next when the species being shaped by evolution gains the power to shape evolution itself. We're the first organisms in Earth's history to face that question. What we do with the answer will echo across evolutionary time for as long as our descendants exist. However long that is, whatever form they take, wherever in the universe they end up. That's the future of human evolution. Not an ending, but a beginning. Not a stop, but an acceleration. Not the conclusion of our evolutionary story, but the opening chapter of something entirely new. So here we are, the end of our journey through 7 million years of human evolution. And if you've made it this far, you know the answer to the question we started with. Have humans stopped evolving? No, we haven't. But we've done something far more interesting. We've changed the rules of the game entirely. Think about what evolution actually is. It's natural selection acting on random genetic variations over millions of generations. It's a blind process, indifferent to suffering, driven purely by reproductive success. For billions of years, this was the only way complex life could arise. No planning, no intention, just survival and death sorting through endless variations until something worked well enough to survive. Every species that ever existed was shaped by this process, shaped unconsciously, unaware of the forces that molded them. A giraffe doesn't know why it has a long neck. A cheetah doesn't understand the evolutionary arms race that gave it speed. They just live, reproduce, and die, while evolution does its work across generations they'll never see. But we're different now. We're the first species in Earth's history to understand evolution while it's still shaping us. We can see the process, study it, predict it, and most incredibly, we can intervene in it. Agriculture didn't stop evolution. It redirected it, selected for traits that let us digest new foods and resist new diseases. Medicine didn't stop evolution. It removed certain selection pressures while creating others, changing which genetic variants succeed in modern populations. Technology didn't stop evolution. It accelerated it in new directions, favoring different traits than the ones that helped our ancestors survive the African savanna. We're evolving right now, today, this generation. Genes for lactose tolerance are still spreading through populations that adopted dairy farming. Genetic resistance to malaria continues to evolve in Africa. Urban populations are developing subtle differences from rural ones. High-altitude peoples carry adaptations their lowland cousins don't have. But the truly revolutionary change isn't genetic, it's cognitive. We've developed a form of evolution that operates thousands of times faster than natural selection. Cultural evolution. The ability to pass down knowledge, skills, and technologies through teaching rather than genes. This is what really changed the game. When your ancestors survived that genetic bottleneck 900,000 years ago, they developed something unprecedented. Not just bigger brains, but better brains. Brains capable of abstract thinking, symbolic reasoning, complex communication. Brains that could learn from others' mistakes without dying themselves. Brains that could imagine things that didn't exist yet and figure out how to create them. This capacity, refined over hundreds of thousands of years and multiple species, eventually gave rise to something no other animal possesses: the ability to consciously shape our own future. We don't just adapt to environments anymore, we change them. We don't just survive selection pressures, we eliminate them or create new ones. We don't just pass down genes, we pass down libraries, universities, entire civilizations worth of accumulated knowledge. And now we stand at the threshold of something even more extraordinary. For the first time, we're developing the technology to edit our own DNA, to choose which traits we want to enhance or eliminate, to potentially direct our own evolution deliberately instead of letting random mutations and natural selection do all the work. This is unprecedented, utterly unique in the history of life on Earth. We're not just products of evolution anymore, we're becoming active participants in it. But here's what's really remarkable about this moment we're living in. This brief window of human history where we understand evolution, but haven't yet fully taken control of it. We can see both directions at once. We can look back at the 7 million years that shaped us, trace the bottlenecks and migrations and adaptations that created modern humanity, and we can look forward, imagining the countless possible futures stretching out before us. Your ancestors survived impossible odds. They endured climate catastrophes that should have killed them all. They crossed oceans and continents with nothing but stone tools and knowledge passed down through generations. They outlasted multiple other human species, not through violence necessarily, but through adaptability, intelligence, and sheer stubborn persistence. Every human alive today carries that legacy. We're all descended from survivors, from individuals who refused to give up even when extinction seemed certain, from populations that held onto their humanity and their knowledge through the darkest times imaginable. And now here you are, lying in the dark, listening to a voice describe the incredible journey that brought you to this moment. Using technology your ancestors couldn't have conceived of, understanding concepts that would have seemed like magic to them, but carrying the same basic genetic toolkit that kept them alive through crisis after crisis. That's worth reflecting on as you drift off to sleep. You're not just a random collection of atoms. You're the product of the greatest survival story ever told. You're the temporary home for genes that have been continuously passed down, generation after generation, across millions of years and countless challenges. Evolution didn't stop. It never stops. But we've reached a point where we can work with it instead of being passively shaped by it. That's the real revolution. Not that we've stopped evolving, but that we've become conscious participants in our own evolutionary story. Before you sleep, drop a comment below. Tell us where in the world you're listening from. Let us know what part of this evolutionary journey surprised you most. And if you found this exploration of human evolution as fascinating as we did creating it, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history that'll help you drift off to sleep while expanding your mind. Sweet dreams, descendants of survivors. May you rest well knowing just how remarkable your existence truly is.